Welcome to Muddy's Whitetail Watch. On this week's episode, I'm going to talk about what makes for the perfect late season stand location. And I'm also going to touch on how to prepare your ground blinds so that deer in feeding areas will accept them more easily. The biggest challenge we face at this time is how to get away from our stand or blind location at the end of legal shooting time without bumping any deer. And you might think that it's not any big deal. You know, so what, there's a couple of non-target deer out in the plot or out in the field, maybe there's a couple of does and some fawns or whatever the case may be. You climb down, those deer see you climb out of the tree or they see you come out of the ground blind and they take off running. That doesn't seem like any big deal, except that has sort of a ripple effect on the rest of the deer that come into that area. So think about this another way. Let's say that the next time that doe comes out into that feeding area, she's a lot more tense around your tree stand location or around that ground blind. Now she's more alert, more wary. This body language is going to transfer to the other deer. They're going to feel less comfortable coming into that same spot. So it has kind of a ripple effect. Anytime you alert even a non-target deer, you reduce the amount of daylight, natural daylight movement that you're going to get in that area slightly. So obviously we want to come up with a system of hunting where we minimize the number of deer that we bump at the end of legal shooting time. And the easiest way to do that is to hunt a stand that is in a small feeding area adjacent to a larger feeding area. And I call these staging area food plots, or staging area stands, where the deer come out, they mill around a little bit prior to the end of legal shooting time, then they move on past. It makes it really easy then to climb down after they've gone by and sneak out the back door and go back to your vehicle. You don't run nearly as much risk of bumping into any deer because they've already filed past you going out into the larger feeding areas. The other upside to these stand locations is the fact that the deer will generally come to them earlier in the evening. If the deer are coming out into the large feeding areas, they're exposing themselves to a lot of risk, or potentially they are, because now they're more visible. And deer don't like that. They like staying close to cover until they have the cover of darkness in order to slip out into those larger feeding areas. Okay, that's one example. The other way that works really well for the late season hunting is to arrange to have somebody come and move the deer off the feeding area at the end of legal shooting time. And I'm sure we've talked about this already and how important it is to keep those deer from not detecting you in your stand location or in your blind location. It doesn't hurt to spook them off there if that if that alarm comes from someplace else, especially if it's something that they're halfway used to, like a vehicle or a tractor or something like that, driving up to the edge of the feeding area and then the deer move off. That's another good example. The third one, and I've got a few of these kind of spots that set up well. They're a lot more rare, but if you have a location where you can hunt it on the side opposite of where the deer come out, a lot of times that gives you some options for sneaking out and getting away from that spot without having to bump into a lot of deer in the process. So those are the three situations that set up well for late season hunting. If you don't have one of those three, you're probably going to be bumping deer. I mean, that's the reality of it. And your success is going to be pretty limited as a result of that, because it doesn't take very long before these deer realize that they're being hunted. And when they detect that consistent human presence in their feeding areas, they stop coming out in those areas during daylight hours. So you want to avoid that at all costs. And like I said, when we first started, that's the biggest challenge of these late season hunts. So let's focus on the ground blind now. This is going to be my tip portion on this week's episode. We've had a lot of success over the years hunting out of ground blinds and feeding areas. And the thing that I've learned is that it takes at least 10 days for the deer to accept a blind when you pop it up right out in the area where they're feeding. And we've learned that using trail cameras and just monitoring those cameras and checking them every day to see how long it takes before the deer start coming back around those blinds. And 10 days is kind of the standard. Obviously longer than that is going to be better, because you want the deer to be as comfortable there as possible, so your first hunt in is as successful as possible, because you only get one chance to have that 100% element of surprise. So the other option then, if you don't have those 2 weeks in order to give the deer time to get acclimated to the blind, in that case, if you put a lot of brush on and around your blind, you can make the deer more comfortable with the blind a lot quicker. You can hang something over the blind. I've taken pieces of wire and taken cedar boughs and attach the wire to one and then to the other and then draped it over the blind. Sometimes you can put a fence post in and you can put some wire around the top to reinforce it all the way around the blind and hang brush off that. Whatever you do to make that look like just a pile of brush is going to make it a whole lot, or is going to shorten the amount of time it takes for the deer to get comfortable with that blind by a lot. So that's, like I said, that's my #1 tip on hunting out of ground blinds and feeding areas. You either got to give them a couple of weeks to get used to it, or you got to put a bunch of brush on and around your blind. Well, I appreciate you joining us this week. I'll see you right back here again next week for the last episode. We got one left of Muddy's Whitetail Watch.